The earthquake that hit Kumamoto, Japan, is over. The disaster it caused is not. A week after the magnitude 7.1 quake struck, temperatures in the region crossed 40 degrees Celsius for the first time ever recorded there, while thousands of survivors were still living in evacuation shelters, and some in their own cars. One elderly woman is now under review as possibly the earthquake's first heat-related casualty, after apparently dying of heat stroke while sheltering in a vehicle. Doctors on the ground are now warning about a second wave of danger that has nothing to do with collapsed buildings, heat stroke and blood clots forming in survivors forced to sit still for days in cramped shelters and cars. Today, we're going back to Kumamoto to show you the disaster that's still unfolding, one that most news coverage has already stopped paying attention to. No guessing, no dramatizing, just the facts, the science, and the real stakes. Let's get into it. Where the numbers stand 1 week later. The magnitude 7.1 earthquake struck Kumamoto Prefecture on July the 28th, 2026, registering Shindo 7, the highest level on Japan's seismic intensity scale. As we covered in our earlier updates, the death toll climbed quickly in the days following the quake. According to Kumamoto's Prefectural Disaster Response Headquarters, as reported by the Japan Times on August 4th, the confirmed toll stood at 38, with 123 people injured. More than 13,000 residential buildings across the prefecture had been assessed as damaged, with 4,622 confirmed as significantly affected. According to GG Press, 1 week after the earthquake struck, more than 7,500 people remained in evacuation shelters, down from a peak of over 9,200 the previous weekend. Some displaced residents chose to sleep in their vehicles rather than crowded shelters, a decision that, as this video will explain, carried its own serious risks. As with any developing disaster, these figures were accurate as of early August, and may have changed by the time you're watching this. The heat that arrived, right on top of the disaster. Here's where this story shifts from an earthquake recovery story into something genuinely different. On Monday, August 3rd, according to the Japan Times, temperatures in Kumamoto Prefecture crossed 40 degrees Celsius, 104 degrees Fahrenheit, for the first time on record there. The city of Kumamoto itself reached 40.3 degrees Celsius. Nearby, Kikuchi hit 40.2, and Kosa reached 39.8. This wasn't an isolated hot day. It arrived directly on top of a population already living without reliable shelter, and in many cases, without full access to water and electricity. We've covered Japan's broader 2026 heatwave crisis on this channel before, including the country's Fire and Disaster Management Agency, formally describing the nation's ongoing extreme heat as a disaster in its own right. What's happening in Kumamoto? Now is that same national heat emergency colliding directly with an already vulnerable, displaced population, arguably the worst possible combination of circumstances for this specific danger. Drop a comment right now. Had you thought about what happens to disaster survivors in the weeks after the emergency officially ends? If you want to keep up with how this story develops, subscribe. It's free, and a thumbs up helps this reach more people. The first confirmed heat death among survivors. According to Kumamoto's prefectural government, a woman in her 70s is believed to have died from heat stroke while sheltering in a vehicle following the earthquake. As of this reporting, her death was still under review to determine whether it will be formally recognized as a disaster-related casualty. The process Japanese authorities use to confirm whether a death in the aftermath of a disaster is officially connected to it. Her situation reflects a pattern authorities observed repeatedly this week: displaced residents choosing their own cars over crowded evacuation centers, sometimes for privacy, sometimes out of lingering fear of aftershocks and enclosed shelter spaces, placing themselves in an environment with limited airflow and cooling during extreme heat that can make a parked car a genuinely dangerous space. This is the same underlying mechanism we explained when covering Japan's broader heatwave crisis. The human body relies primarily on sweat evaporation to shed excess heat, and that system becomes progressively less effective as both temperature and humidity climb. A vehicle sitting in direct sun can reach internal temperatures well above the outside air fairly quickly, a documented hazard that becomes significantly more dangerous for an elderly person already under the physical and emotional stress of having survived a major earthquake and lost access to their home. Why disaster-related deaths are their own tracked category. Japanese disaster response agencies use a specific, established category for this, one that goes back to previous disasters, including the 2016 Kumamoto earthquake, distinguishing between deaths caused directly by an earthquake, structural collapse, falling debris, and what officials term disaster. Related deaths, fatalities caused by the conditions and hardship that follow in a disaster's aftermath, exhaustion, dehydration, inadequate medical care, or, in this case, extreme heat exposure while displaced. According to the Japan Times, medical Experts on the ground in Kumamoto this week specifically flagged both heat stroke and blood clots as active concerns for survivors. The latter, a genuine, well-documented medical risk connected to prolonged immobility, exactly the kind of condition that develops when people spend days sitting in cramped evacuation shelters or vehicles without normal movement or circulation. This distinction matters because it reflects something we've discussed before on this channel regarding disaster recovery broadly, most directly in our video covering Venezuela's earthquake recovery 1 month after that country's June disaster. The dramatic, visible phase of a disaster, collapsed buildings, search and rescue, generates intense attention for days. The quieter, ongoing phase that follows, in this case, a population of thousands managing extreme heat exposure with damaged infrastructure and disrupted water access, often continues causing genuine harm long after headlines move on. And Kumamoto's disaster-related death toll figures are the direct official acknowledgement of that pattern. What officials are doing about it? Kumamoto. Governor Takashi Kimura has moved to address the crisis directly, announcing that authorities have begun arranging transfers for displaced residents, from emergency shelters into hotels and other accommodation facilities across the cities of Uto, Uki, and Yatsushiro, along with the town of Hikawa. Every person affected by the disaster is eligible to relocate to these secondary facilities, and leaflets explaining the process were distributed at evacuation centers this week. We will make preparations so that evacuees can relocate as soon as possible, Kimura told reporters. Beyond hotel relocations, prefectural authorities have announced plans for 50 makeshift housing units to be constructed in Uki and 20 in Hikawa, the two areas that experienced the heaviest damage from the original earthquake, providing a longer-term housing option for displaced families beyond. Both the shelters and the temporary hotel placements. Disaster response coordination in the region has formally shifted focus this week, from the initial search and rescue phase toward what officials describe as stabilizing survivors' lives and actively working to prevent further disaster-related casualties. A direct official acknowledgement that the danger to this population, a week after the earthquake itself, has fundamentally changed in nature rather than disappeared. Why this matters beyond Kumamoto. Kumamoto's situation this week represents about as direct and unfortunate a collision between two separate hazard types as it's possible to document. A historic earthquake and a historic heat wave arriving in the exact same population within the exact same week. A disaster that displaces thousands of people creates a vulnerability window that can persist for weeks after the original event, one where survivors, already physically and emotionally depleted, become measurably more susceptible to whatever hazard happens to arrive next. The resulting disaster-related death toll here is the clearest possible evidence of why Japan's disaster response system, built specifically around lessons from earlier earthquakes like 2016, plans for exactly this kind of compounding secondary risk, rather than treating recovery as simply the absence of the original hazard. The immediate priority going forward is speed, getting displaced residents out of vehicles and shelters and into hotels or the newly planned makeshift housing units before the heat causes further harm. Prefectural officials have not given a firm completion date for the 50 units planned in Uki and 20 in Hikawa, meaning shelters and hotel placements will likely remain the primary option for at least several more weeks. Kumamoto's woman's death, once formally reviewed, is expected to set a precedent for how any further heat-related fatalities among displaced residents get classified and counted going forward, a process that, historically, following past Japanese disasters, has sometimes taken officials weeks or months to finalize. An earthquake, measured in seconds of violent shaking, produced a death toll that, a week later, was still being reassessed, not from new structural collapse, but from heat, quietly working through a population that had nowhere fully safe to escape it. That's a genuinely difficult thing to sit with, and it's exactly the kind of detail that gets lost once a disaster's most dramatic footage stops generating headlines. Kumamoto's earthquake happened in an instant. The heat that followed it has been working for a full week, and by the prefecture's own admission, the danger to survivors hasn't ended. It's changed shape entirely, from falling debris to something as ordinary and as lethal as a hot car with nowhere else to go. If you want us to keep tracking Kumamoto's recovery, subscribe, and we'll bring you the next verified update. See you in the next one.